Hello, everyone, and welcome to our today's episode. I think it's the fourth or the fifth episode of the joint IUFRO and Superb forest restoration talks. This series of talks is organized by the Superb project, which is working on forest restoration in Europe, and the IUFRO task force transforming forest landscape for future climates and human well-being, which is working internationally. And today we will talk about how governments commit to forest restoration, but really what it does take to restore forests, including very practical inputs. And we have a couple of rules for this webinar. So please, next slide. First of all, this webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be available later on via the IUFRO YouTube account and on the IUFRO website. If you have questions to Stephanie and Mercy, and I want to point out that it's extremely great to have two female presenters today because it's International Women's Day. If you have questions to our great speakers today, please use the Q&A box. And please also be prepared that we promote you to be panelists so that you can ask the questions live, which is always nicer because it means that we can actually engage with you even in this virtual setting. So please be prepared to enable your camera and your microphone if you post a question in the chat. If you want to tweet about the webinar, you can, of course, tag us. Either IUFRO or Superb project, and yeah, you can, if you haven't followed us yet, please do so, then you get also regular updates from the two of us. And now I would like to hand over to my colleague Andreas, who is your moderator today.
Thank you, Gesche, and a warm welcome also from my side to all of you. Yeah, it's a real pleasure to moderate today the talks of two outstanding female researchers at this International Women's Day. And at first, I would like to introduce to you Stephanie Mansourian. Stephanie is an outstanding researcher dealing with a special focus also on FLR issues and questions, also in the context of governance and ecosystem services. And she has obtained PhD at the University of Geneva, but worked for many, many years in different activities, especially also for the World Wildlife Fund in different global programs, and especially in Asia and Africa. And she has also close contacts and collaborations in the context of IUCN, World Bank, and IUFRO, and she's also author of two major books on forest landscape restoration, where she's able to compile studies and contributions of more than 70 authors. And she has also published many articles, especially in the last 10 years, in high-level scientific journals, for example, like Environmental Conservation, Restoration Ecology, Forest Policy and Economics, and many more. So, she's also the co-coordinator of our IUFRO task force. And so she will really bring in a special view and on the question of how can governments rule and what governance can play as a role for successes, but perhaps also failures in forest landscape restoration. And I'm also happy to introduce our second speaker, Mercy Derkyi from Ghana. So, and Mercy, I've just seen that in our program, she has a title as a senior lecturer, but since last year, she is already a professor at the University of Energy and Natural Resources in Kumasi in Ghana. And I've seen that you're the first professor, female professor at the university. So So it's a really nice example for a career of women in academics. And she's also specialist in forest landscape restoration, with a special focus also on governance, but also forest policy and socioeconomics. She was also for several years the deputy coordinator of the Division 9 in IUFRO on forest policy and economics. And she has also published lots of papers and received also different scholarships, high-level scholarships, and worked for many years also in the context of, and she brings also very or especially in the focus also from the African side as a very important continent, and Ghana as a country for forest landscape restoration. So it's a really great pleasure to give the floor to you, Stephanie. I think you will start with the presentation, and Mercy, you will add then also your views and comments.
Thank you very much, Andreas, and thank you, Geshe, as well. I would just like to add that I wear many hats, and you listed some of them, Andreas, but I'm actually a full-time consultant, so that is my main hat. So maybe the less interesting of all of them, but that's basically what I do. So my presentation today, I actually was inspired this morning to change it quite substantially. So I hope it actually works. So please bear with me because, as I say, it's fresh from this morning. So I had something ready, but decided today that I would do something slightly different. So yes, so I'm going to start, and then I'll hand over to Mercy, who I think might not be using PowerPoint, but anyway, I'm hiding behind my PowerPoint slides. So the topic that I'm basically focusing on is looking at enabling factors to scale up forest landscape restoration, with a particular emphasis on the governance dimensions. So I'm not at all looking at the ecological factors. Let's just be clear here. This isn't my area of expertise. So it really is looking at the governance dimensions to scale up forest landscape restoration. So I'll first introduce a bit of the context, highlight some definitions, look a bit at the international governance framework, and then look at some of the frameworks and case studies. So this is based on a range of different research areas that I've covered in the last few years, and then look at some outstanding questions and conclusions. So as I say, I hope this will work. So yes, please bear with me. So the context, as we know, forest loss and degradation continue to afflict our planet. The latest FAO data from the Forest Resource Assessment shows that in the period 2015-2020, although we gained 5 million hectares of forest, we also lost 10 million every year. So a net loss of forest. And of course, forest degradation is much harder to quantify, but is in much greater figures. And the impacts of that loss and degradation are felt on the livelihoods of at least 3.2 billion people. It affects our climate, it affects biodiversity, and the contributions that nature provides us. So for all those reasons, we're looking at the importance of restoration. So basically, the need to protect what is there exists. We need to tackle the root causes of that loss and degradation, and we also need to restore. There are many initiatives that are seeking to restore at the international level. So most of you are probably familiar with the Bond Challenge, which was established in 2011 to restore 150 million hectares by 2020 and 350 million hectares by 2030. That was followed by a series of regional initiatives. So we have all of these enormous targets to restore huge areas of forest. These are targets set by national governments in international fora, but to date, we're still failing to see these the scale of those commitments in practice. So just to go back to some key definitions, when I'm talking about forest landscape restoration, it was defined over 20 years ago as a planned process that aims to regain both ecological integrity and also to enhance human well-being in deforested or degraded landscapes. There have been some slight adaptations to that definition, but in essence, that's what we're talking about. And governance in the context of forest landscape restoration is the decision-making rules, structures, and processes involved in restoring a forested landscape. It includes the widest set of institutions and stakeholders at all levels, and the way in which they connect and interrelate over time to influence the implementation of FLR and the process of restoring a landscape. So at the international level, which is what often people think about when they're thinking about governance, they're thinking about all those big international processes. So we've got the framework at the international level. I just want to move this because I can't see my slides. Okay. So the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, that the Glasgow Climate Pact emphasizes the importance of restoring nature and forests that act as sinks and reservoirs of greenhouse gases. So in the context of achieving those global targets under the UNFCCC, the importance of forests has been increasingly highlighted. In the Convention on Biological Diversity, we've also got in the latest Kunming-Montreal Agreement the importance of restoring forests at the level of goals and at the level of targets in that agreement. We've got major scientific assessments like the Intergovernmental Panel, Science Policy Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, which notes that on average, the benefits of restoration are 10 times higher than the costs. So this is the land degradation study by IPBES, which looked at the challenges posed by land degradation and what we need to do to reverse it. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change also, in its latest report, highlighted the importance of restoring ecosystems. Now, if you look at the Sustainable Development Goals, the IPBES report that I mentioned earlier also notes that avoiding, reducing, and reversing land degradation is essential to meet the Sustainable Development Goals. This image, which I know Andreas likes a lot, so I thought I would use it, is from an article a few years ago where I was looking at the interpretation of forest landscape restoration by different communities and the importance of forest landscape restoration. So that's the central parts. The roles of forest landscape restoration are important in terms of building natural capital, but also in terms of sustaining timber production, in terms of mitigating climate change, for biodiversity conservation, and also to reverse land degradation and improve food security. So if we look at all of these roles of forest landscape restoration, the outer rim of the flower then associates those with specific goals, specific sustainable development goals. So we can see that FLR can contribute to many, if not all, of the sustainable development goals. So at the high level, we've got the commitments, but now what? That's the question that we are actually here to explore. So as I said early on, I'm going to just review some frameworks and some case studies to start this discussion on looking at how do we actually translate all of these commitments into practice. So this is one of the frameworks that I like to work with. Which is looking, so I've defined FLR and I've defined governance. So if we look at those two processes, the governance process and the FLR process, some of the key elements where those two processes interrelate are firstly looking at rescaling. So when I started the presentation, I focused very much on those high level aspects of governance. But at the end of the day, governance with respect to forest landscape restoration is important at all these different levels, at the local, at the landscape, at the national, and at the global level, and the way these different levels interrelate. So it's not just the international commitments, but then it's also how those translate into national policies, and then also how that translates at the landscape scale in the support that is necessary to effectively implement restoration at the landscape scale. And then how that relates with the local realities on the ground, how it relates to local traditions, local norms, local decision-making structures. So this whole dimension of rescaling is one very important aspect of FLR and governance. And then the top part, mapping stakeholders. So again, especially if we consider these different scales, there are stakeholders at all of these different scales that have a valuable role to play, and I'll elaborate a bit more on that in some of the next slides. But it's important to understand who the stakeholders are in the process of forest landscape restoration. And then contextualizing. So there is no one size fits all. The difference in the different contexts make forest landscape restoration what it is in that local environment. So it's very important not to come with ready-made solutions that can be applied across the board, but to understand the actual context. And through that, to be able to then identify what are some of the governance problems and determine some of the governance solutions. So this is just a slide to show some of the diversity of actors in forest landscape restoration. So in terms of the disciplines, it could be forestry experts, but it could also be agriculture experts. It could be anthropologists. You've got extension workers. You've got the actual communities and landowners on the ground. You've got the whole research community that has an important role to play, as we're still learning a lot about deforestation processes and restoration processes. You've got the donor and the investor community that is increasingly playing a major role in investing in restoration and in transforming landscapes. You've got the private sector that is investing loads of money in planting trees, but not necessarily the right sorts of trees in the right sorts of places. So, but they're a major stakeholder and actor in the FLR process that we need to understand and engage with. Policymakers, of course. So yes, they each play different roles, they each have different interests, and therefore there's also different power relations that need to be understood in all the different actors in forest landscape restoration. So this is from another article on discipline sectors, motivations, and power relations in forest landscape restoration. And so what this is intended to demonstrate is the fact that you need to understand what is behind each stakeholder. So I won't go into detail in this diagram, but it really is not just saying, okay, we've identified these are the different stakeholder groups, but actually to understand where they're coming from. So what motivates them, and why would they participate in forest landscape restoration, or why would they not participate? And so that you can also better understand how to change, how to incentivize them to participate, or how to bring in different stakeholders, and how to address some of the power challenges that are going to inevitably going to appear in a landscape where you're dealing with different stakeholders. Because of course, that is one of the definitions of working at a landscape scale, is that you're working with many different stakeholders. And as I say, many of them coming from different backgrounds, different disciplines, different interests. And therefore, the dynamics are what is going to be challenging to actually achieve the targeted action that you want. So looking at some examples of solutions. So for ease of presentation, I've split them as sort of top down and bottom up. So the top down aspects that I'm going to briefly look at are what motivates governments, what tools have they got that they can use to incentivize and to implement and promote forest landscape restoration, and what mechanisms can they use. So in terms of motivation, this is from a study I did a couple of years ago, and Mercy contributed to it as well, which was looking at some case studies to see how what motivated governments to engage in forest landscape restoration or in forest restoration more generally, actually. And we found a whole series of motivations that are at the level of social, ecological, political, economic aspects, and that those triggers for restoration aren't always as obvious as one might think. So in some of the case studies, for example, in Bhutan, Colombia, Costa Rica, Georgia, and Kenya, biodiversity conservation and ecotourism were major motivating factors to engage in restoration. Safeguarding hydroelectricity, on the other hand, was a major priority in understandably more mountainous countries such as Bhutan, for example. In terms of some of the tools that can be used for forest landscape restoration, payments for ecosystem services that we hear a lot about have been used for both forest protection and restoration in the context, for example, of Vietnam's major drive for restoration, but also in Brazil's Espírito Santo state that has a target for restoration. Having a national level agency that is tasked with restoration is another factor that is helpful. And this exists, for example, in Colombia, where they have a strategy for restoration. So, and that's also associated with an agency, and also in Costa Rica. The valuation, so the economics as well are important, and cost-benefit analyses have been used as a way of justifying restoration and better understanding what are the costs and the benefits. So, for example, in Kenya, which has a target of increasing its forest cover to 10%, the analysis they did was that would cost them about $440 million. But the cost of not doing anything was much, much higher. So that's another way of motivating and incentivizing restoration. Having interministerial agencies is a very effective way of ensuring, or at least reducing, the risk of conflicting policies, which is something that often appears in land use, where we might have agriculture policies conflicting with environment policies, for example. So at least in Kenya, Ethiopia, and Costa Rica, this is something that has been put in place, often under the banner of climate change priorities, because that climate change and addressing climate change appears as a bit of an umbrella. But whatever the reason, at the end of the day, having those interministerial agencies is something that can facilitate forest landscape restoration implementation. In terms of some of the policies that are helpful, so I mentioned that Kenya has in its constitution the desire to have 10% forest cover. Bhutan as well has in its constitution a 60% minimum forest cover. So the advantage of having that embedded in the constitution is that it goes beyond a given government, which provides for that longevity that is needed when we're dealing with forests and landscapes. Alignment with multilateral environmental agreements, such as the Biodiversity Agreement and the UNFCCC, which I mentioned early on, having, again, something that is embedded in the plans that governments produce and report on under these different multilateral environmental agreements provides some sense of continuity and longevity and long-term investment as well, which is useful for a process such as FLR. Co-management arrangements, which have been growing in the forest sector in the last few decades, can also be applied for restoration. And for example, in Madagascar, which has specific legislation on co-management. The one of the projects there that was led by WWF inserted the commitments for restoration in the same contracts that were being developed under those co-management arrangements. So that's another effective tool that can be adapted for restoration as well. Tenure is a big issue. So tenure not only of land and or forests, but also even of individual trees. And I'm hoping that Mercy might talk a bit about the issue, the important issue of tree tenure in Ghana, which provides for some security that those who have the tenure can actually benefit from the forests or the trees. Devolution to lower levels of government is another important aspect. There's been some research, for example, on the fact that frequently a result of all these high-level commitments is that funding is provided to the national level government, but that funding doesn't necessarily trickle to the local level, where the authorities are the ones working with communities to try and implement forest landscape restoration. So ensuring that devolution is real and effective is important as well, to provide for the support in the local landscape where restoration is taking place. And that also applies to extension services. So, for example, again, in a mountainous context like Bhutan, but also in other countries where the landscapes where forest restoration is prioritized might be quite remote, it is really important to have those extension services empowered to assist in the restoration process. Now, looking from the other end a bit bottom up, the recognition of rights for local communities is also a very important dimension in forest landscape restoration. There are many examples, many bad examples of communities engaging in projects just because that's what they're expected to do, but because there's no real change in the rights that they have and in their empowerment, as soon as the project finishes or as soon as the donor goes, the projects just revert back to what was there before. So the actual real recognition of rights for local communities is something that we're increasingly understanding is an absolute priority to work in landscapes, in forested landscapes. Now, related to that, having mechanisms that allow local level participatory decision making is also fundamental, so that those mechanisms can be based in local level institutions. So working with local chiefs, working with local traditional authorities is often a mechanism that can help achieve the right decisions in the landscape for the long term, and to effectively engage the communities that live in the landscape. So here's a quote from the latest IPCC, that cooperation and inclusive decision-making with local communities and indigenous peoples, as well as recognition of inherent rights of indigenous peoples, is integral to successful forest adaptation in many areas. Now, there are also a massive amount of local initiatives that we just we haven't sufficiently analyzed and collected data on, simply because they are local and because they are not noted in scientific journals or in other mechanisms that we are more accustomed to reading or to accessing. But there are many local initiatives that need to be from which we can learn and from which we can actually take lessons that can be adapted to other contexts. But many local communities are already engaging in activities that are associated with forest landscape restoration. So We've got farmer-managed natural regeneration that is taking place in a lot of places. And in Kenya, for example, a review suggested that at least 70% of community forest associations are engaging already in some sort of tree planting that is beneficial to the landscape, because they live in that landscape and they understand the ecosystem services that those trees can provide in the landscape. Contractual arrangements of some sort are also many of the landscape contexts have analyzed. I found that there is always some form of be it a contract, be it a charter, be it some sort of semi-formal document. It does not have to necessarily be major legal text within that territory that allows the stakeholders to agree to a common vision and to common actions in the landscape. So that is something that's an important factor as well, to have that sort of tool and mechanism to somehow formalize the relationship among actors involved in restoration in the landscape. Now, this is from another report I did for the FAO, looking at key success factors for FLR in Africa. And I won't go through all of the different elements of the puzzle here, but maybe emphasize just partnerships and collaboration. And that goes back to some of the different stakeholder groups that I highlighted earlier. So the importance of getting different stakeholders to partner and collaborate in some sort of network or some sort of alliance is a very effective way of advancing FLR. So what now? We've got lots of initiatives. We've got a clearly increasing need for FLR. We've got all of these global commitments and national commitments. So I think it's really important to use science to inform policies, and also to use experience on the ground to build realistic projects. So there are many experiences that, as I say, maybe fall under the radar because they're not necessarily picked up by the traditional scientific community, but it doesn't make them any less valuable. And then I think it's really important to link then this bottom up and top down that I've just briefly outlined for you. So some of the outstanding questions as well I'm nearly finished, don't worry. So how do you achieve both forest quality and quantity? I think that is a major challenge we're still experiencing with forest landscape restoration. We're seeing some small scale examples of good forest quality and restoration, but not that huge quantity. We're seeing these commitments for vast quantities, but how do you reconcile those two? So that's what we're grappling with and what I tried to explore and provide some answers to, but I think we still need much more on how to reconcile those two, and it's a top priority. Also, how do you define success in forest landscape restoration? And that relates to that quantity and quality dimension as well, with too much emphasis so far on numbers of trees. And honestly, how much scaling up is feasible? I mean, I think we need to also be realistic and maybe not have unrealistic expectations of what is feasible. How's progress measured? That is related to how you define success. And then also, how do you attribute cause and effect? So again, without effective monitoring, and monitoring is, as many of you I'm sure know, a priority under the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration, because unless we can monitor, we don't know what works, we don't know what impact we're having, and we can't make any adaptive changes. So in conclusion, the need for FLR is clear, commitments are there, actions are needed at all the different levels that I've identified. The time is right, and there are several opportunities that will help facilitate this change. But there's a sense of urgency. So I just want to close with this quote from the IPBES. that the implementation of known proven actions to combat land degradation and thereby transform the lives of millions of people across the planet will become more difficult and costly over time. So there is a sense of urgency. Thank you, and I'd like to hand over now to Mercy.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. That was a wonderful presentation. And greetings to the audience also. Just to add, I think you made the point so clear. This is not news only in Kenya or in other parts of the country. Restoration is needed across board. So most of the issues you raised, just like in Ghana, issues of tenure are very important that one needs to consider in terms of restoration. Last year, August, together with a team from Wageningen University, we went ahead with a kind of a conference. And before then, it was a project on what we call the nature-based solution for food, of which forest landscape restoration was also part, as well as what we call the rainwater harvesting. And most of the points through the work that you have done were all reflected during the stakeholder engagements. And we cannot talk of restoration without talking about stakeholders. And also their multiple nature with their different views, similar interests, and diverse interests. So it's very important. These stakeholders made clear some points, and I just want to highlight about just 5, which are also in line with what you presented. Issues, if you want to scale up nature-based, then, if you want to scale up forest restoration, then we need to make sure there's land for it, because it's a land-based agenda. Without availability of land, and Africa issues of land tenure, as well as trees are also a bit of challenge. Land means ownership, your right to hold and to use it. So people are really concerned about issues of the land. And another important point they raise is also the suitability, and it is in line with what you indicated in the previous studies of whether it's quantity or quality or a blend that we are looking at. Another important is also at which scale are we operating? Are we just focusing at the global scale, or we are paying attention to even the landscape level at the community level? Interestingly, today my team are in the field trying to explore what are the enablers and also the barriers of restoration in the region in which we are in. And they want to critically look at the sociocultural implication and as well as economic and environmental effect of these landscape issues. So these are very important points in terms of landscape, and most of these issues cut across, especially in Africa or Ghana, where most of our cultivation and restoration are rainfall dependent. And if they are rainfall, it means that we need to have also mechanism with issues of climate changing. The timing for rain patterns really affects some of these restoration. So people are now seeking, should we engage in what we call rain harvesting? But the question is, how much can we harvest? And how do we even use to water these restoration projects? I know for instance, Ghana is doing well in terms from the government level, where in 2001, restoration was taken seriously in terms of reforestation. But it comes to mind, are we fulfilling the 3 pillars in terms of social, economic, and environmental? That will let us know whether it is successful or not. As we pointedly said, we are looking at success from whose lens? that is something that probably, because each of these stakeholders have their interests and keen interests. As a community member, my interest is the food aspect of it. As a government, my interest may be with respect with the trees and how I may get the straight boughs to get the timber from it. So whose interest to measure the sources? But it's also very important for us to measure the sources of it. But we need to consider the diverse interests. Diversity and multiple stakeholders also brings the complexity nature of it. As well as, I think another important issue raised by the stakeholders who met in August 2022 was also in terms of trying to align, especially in Ghana, our land use practices. We need to have a kind of synergy because different sectors operate. We have the agriculture sector with its ministerial different ministry. We have the forestry, different ministry. So these different, unless different sectors, unless they come together, there may be some challenges in terms of the landscape we all yearn to look at. So I think these are the few points, but whatever it is, whether we want to fulfill the global landscape restoration agenda or the African 100 restoration or whatever we want to do, it also goes back to funding. And how do we also manage the funds? It's also another important. How do we account for it? How do we ensure effective monitoring and evaluation? And just like we clearly indicated, how do we really assess it well? And what tools do we need to use for us to achieve that and fulfill our SDGs and also the effect of climate on the environment? Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you very much, Mercy. Thank you very much, Stephanie, for this really inspiring insights in the topic of governance, tenure, and what else, all the aspects of which are really relevant in terms of forest landscape restoration. Now we will start more or less with the discussion. At the beginning, I would like to ask two questions. The first one, I think this is always also something which is always comes into my mind, talking about the success of forest landscape restoration. As a forest ecologist or a silviculturist, I was thinking a lot of more or less the main aim is the recovery of forest landscape or forest cover. But if you think a bit further, it's quite clear it might be also linked to the acceptance of forest development of the local communities. So are they fine with a landscape development? But the first could be also the question, are the desired or required ecosystem services provided by forest landscape restoration? And this is perhaps also one point I would like to ask you perhaps to comment on this. What is your view on it, or is it all, or has it different priorities? And the second one is, I'm observing in the last years more or less an upcoming initiative of carbon offsets, which is more or less brought up by the private sector. So private companies are interested to be engaged in forest landscape restoration and more or less to obtain carbon offsets for their emissions. What do you think about the future role of these, I would say, private sector carbon offsets, emission certificates? Is it an interesting development for forest landscape restoration, or is it just is it perhaps not so important from your point of view?
Should I start, and Mercy, you can add something? So on your first point, I think it's essential to go beyond the ecological processes if we want to achieve large-scale restoration. I think, to me, that's what defines FLR from restoration on one landowner's private land. I think if you're looking at one landowner's private land, either they're engaged or they're not in restoration. And if they are, then there's no particular issue. You're looking at restoring your ecological processes, and that's fine. But by definition, when you're looking at a landscape, you're looking at different stakeholders, you're looking at different interests, then you will have trade-offs, and you will have to reconcile those trade-offs. Otherwise, it's just not going to be successful in the long term. And, you know, there are many instances of forests being burnt or small saplings being burnt as opposition to an FLR initiative or a restoration initiative that did not consult local communities, that did not engage with them, that did not take their point of view into account. So one easy way for them to do away with that is to burn it, and that goes against anyone's desires in investing in FLR in a landscape. So you do need to reconcile those different priorities. On your second point, maybe now's not the best time to be talking about carbon offsets when there's been a lot of criticism of carbon offsets recently. But in theory, it could definitely be a source of revenue for forest landscape restoration. In practice, we're not there yet. As we can see, there's still a lot that needs to be improved in the mechanism as it stands just for carbon. But if we want it to be useful for something like forest landscape restoration that goes well beyond carbon, that's looking at benefits of restoring forests for people, as well as biodiversity, as well as potentially carbon, then we need mechanisms that are much more robust and much more comprehensive. So we're not there yet, but we may well need to explore that as a source of income for scaling up. Mercy, do you want to add anything to what I said?
Yeah, thank you very much, Andres. Thank you, Stephanie. Yeah, I think you've said it, or especially in terms of who is wearing the lens and whose lens. Is it the ecologist, or is it the social science forester, or is it the economist? So that is always the issue at hand. Ideally, in terms of sustainability, then the three should go hand in hand. But whatever it is, there is always a kind of imbalance. So a little trying to have, we don't want a perfect equity in terms of 50-50, but at least there should be element depending on your objective and purpose. There should be an element of each of the three pillars. So if you are from the government or ecological perspective, let us see the element of economics a little bit in it, as well as in social. Likewise, the other. That is with respect to the first. I have to add to what Stephanie said. The second, yes, carbon became a very interesting concept that everybody was embracing. But let's come back to Africa, and especially in Ghana, where issues of tenure, land, has its duration, that at what time should one wait? If it is a kind of free land or a land that is yours, then engaging it in the carbon credits may be excellent. Whereby even for government of Ghana, it may not be so easy because the ownership of the land is different from the resources. You know, most of our lands are in stools, and these stools are expecting to receive benefits, whether financial benefits or whatever benefit that you accrued from the forest. So if they have to wait for a very long time before they have their share, then there is a challenge. So just like Stephanie said, yes, it's good. We can pilot it by people with their private lands which is not so common in my part of the world or in Ghana, but we can look at it, or part of the land in which the government has bought outright, where there is a kind of tenura arrangement. Carbon credit may not be a nice meal for people to embrace. So that is my few points with respect to that. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephanie. Thank you, Mercy. Perhaps only one comment, perhaps also an idea to combine the carbon offsets also with kinds of ecological restoration. I know also a project from the Land Life company that they more or less, and they are also now active on, I think, on 5 continents. And one of their ideas really to say, to go with native tree species and more or less to promote a natural forest landscape development, but then also take also carbon offsets into account, because I know, of course, about the criticism of just more or less planting high productive non-native tree species and just then to say, okay, we have a maximization of carbon offsets, but this might be not really sustainable at the long end. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Thank you. So we have also now a question from the audience. So and I see, hello, Eliska. So please ask your question.
Hello. Thank you very much for a very interesting talk. I must say I really like this series. Thank you. And for the question, I was wondering if there is some scientific study on the success of the large-scale afforestation projects, because they tend to get a lot of media attention, let's say. But I was wondering if there is some follow-up on their success. Thank you.
So just off the top of my head, there have definitely been, well, for a start, there aren't that many large-scale forestation projects. The Chinese case is an important one, and there have been many studies showing both the valuable dimensions of the afforestation work in China and the negative dimensions, and the negative ones being essentially related to biodiversity and to community, to the diversity of services provided by forests to communities. But the positive ones being that they've achieved massive amounts of tree planting. So it goes back to the question of what are you measuring, and who's, as Mercy said, whose success. But that's an interesting, and there are, as I say, there are studies showing both sides. So that's an interesting case if you look that one up. The Great Green Wall for the Sahara and Sahel initiative has had a significant amount of funding and is receiving more funding. There has been a midterm evaluation a couple of years ago that was not very positive. So there's information there as well on that initiative. Off the top of my head, that's what I'd like to say. Mercy, if you want to add something.
Yes, thank you. Maybe I'll add it from Ghana perspective. Ghana in 2001, we started the reforestation project at the national level. It began well, trying to bring into focus the 3 pillars of social, economic, and environmental. But maybe a lot of success in terms of an annual report has been written. Maybe it's calls for academic research in depth that's now 20 years and over. What has it really been? But one beautiful, which we still cherish, component is the engagement of the local communities as shareholders in a process called the modified Tonja system, whereby the communities fringing these forests, degraded forests, are given portions. It used to be there, but now the different thing 20 years back was that issues of tenure, issues of benefit sharing was also introduced. and issues of local people can stay on the land for a longer duration. They also have a share in terms of turning the sales of the turning of the plantations and the rest. So probably I have not seen a very continuous study, and it brings to mind, thanks so much for this webinar, for us to probably a study to be looked at 20 years on the line, because I was fortunate, immediately I completed school, I was part of the process and of the launch. And now we are almost 2 decades now. What is indeed a success story? Because we have it across the country. And there were different schemes. Besides the community engagement, there was also the private sector engagement and the government institution themselves engagement with different names together. So I cannot say it has been totally successful. I know in some quarters it has been said that we've seen success in the reforestation. However, we've also seen big success, negative success in terms of degradation. So how do we balance the two? So that is also a study that needs to be looked into. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for this discussion. Yes, we have also now another question by Anna. So may you please ask your question?
Thank you very much, Stephanie, Mercy, for your interesting inputs. My question raised from the history of restoration, especially in Europe, okay, Mediterranean countries. So the experience from the past teaches us that in the past, when dealing with very large scale project of forest restoration in the degraded areas, one of the problems introduced was to create very homogeneous systems, because the simplification helped also from the technical part, was easier to create a simple system. If we think to the forests of the future, in areas that are much affected by disturbance like wildfire, or this very hectic behavior of climate in terms of rainfall distribution, how can we consider this? So we need to deal with large scale and a very large heterogeneity in ecological condition and anomalies. And this is crucial also for the success, how we can design resilient system on a large scale, because this is not a very, I know that is more a technical ecological question, but for sure it's part of the framework of the success. So if you have experience and hints to suggest in this direction.
Who want to respond?
Yeah, maybe let me try to share a few points. I think one of the challenges during Stephanie's presentation is in terms of the restoration, the quality and the quantity with respect to biodiversity. And we know the reality and the role that the biodiversity in terms of flora or fauna, they play in our ecosystem. So when we have a kind of monoculture or a kind of one species kind of establishment, then we have encountered, just like you said, with respect to issues of fire and so many other things. Because, and when it comes to distractions, everything goes off and we go back to zero. Because if it is a kind of a mist, which is mist forest, trying to mimic the natural forest, then you realize that some which are fire prone or those that can resist fire can stand and also be maintained. I think it has been a major concern even in restoration. And let me once again use Ghana example. It was a big challenge. Initially, we tried to maintain most of the indigenous species. But you know, most of these indigenous species also takes time in terms of their growth, maturity period. And this is concerned especially for the private developer. So that is why most of them will go for exotic species which are fast growing, but they also have their side effects which are not so good. So if you look at Ghana landscape, there are some mixture of these trees. However, most of them are exotic, and people have started questioning the frequent incidents of fire, as well as questioning the extent of certain animal species or plant species that may not be able to stand under some of these trees, which are kind of mono. So it is, it all goes back to the purpose and to who is wearing which lens. But ideally, if we have destroyed the nature, which is a blend of everything, then one would have expected us to restore the nature with nature, mimic it nicely. But probably also look at the duration. How long will it take for an indigenous species like Kaya singalensis, which takes a very long time, years to grow, than maybe a Tectona grandis or teak, which takes only 20 years or 15 years to get a pole and 20 years to get a lumber. So these are all tricky things. So it depends on who. One will also tell you, yes, we will go into the monoculture, but we will make sure we take some of the effects. So we are going to make sure we establish a green fire belt. It can, to safeguard it, and then we have our output quickly to get the income that we need. So I don't know, it's a tricky, and it depends on what we really want. How do we blend both the nature as well as the economic and ecological? Thank you.
Thank you a lot. Thanks a lot.
I just want to add one small point, and it's, if I'd shown the slides I had initially planned to show, you would have seen it, but there are, the way forest landscape restoration was defined and clarified a few years later. It has 6 principles, and one of the principles relates to many of the things I did discuss in my presentation, even if I didn't put it under that umbrella of the principle, which is about restoring multiple functions for multiple benefits. Yeah. And so if you are looking at multiple functions, you inevitably have to look at a more complex ecosystem. And so, as you quite rightly mentioned, some of the simplistic monocultures or semi-monocultures that have been restored in the past may not actually be achieving these multiple functions for multiple benefits for multiple people, taking into account as well, not just the current generations, but future generations with climate change. So I think inevitably it's kind of inherent in a forest landscape restoration approach that you are looking at a more complex forest ecosystem, at restoring a more complex forest ecosystem.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. And perhaps also one comment from my side, because I have today a conversation with a private forest owner, and he has lost, I think, 1/2 of his spruce forest area. And he was thinking, what should I do? Should I more or less now plant beech forest, which belongs more or less to the potential nature vegetation? Shall I more or less skip to more drought-resistant, heat-resistant systems with oaks, or should I more or less import sub-Mediterranean tree species, something like this? So, so we see that we have an erosion of paradigms of more or less, if we just thinking of today's natural vegetation or native, non-native. So, and this is also one idea what we have discussed a lot also in our task force, how we can more or less promote also species migration, assisted migration, and not in a way to produce I would say, artificial forests, but more or less to include them. I think the idea of the mixture of today's native vegetation and tree species with more or less invading tree species, so not invading in terms of invasive, but more or less species coming in. And so at the end, it's also the idea that we are managing tree species ranges in a multiple way and in a much more dynamic way than just to look on a site and say, okay, this is a native and non-native, and this is a site-adapted or non-site-adapted tree species. And I think this is also the idea that we are getting more and more in a role of a regional forest landscape manager instead of managing single stands. I think this is also very important. Yes, but I would like to ask you, Gesche, there are also some anonymous questions in the chat, so may you ask some of them?
Yes, of course. I also want to add to what you just said, that when you engage with stakeholders, with local stakeholders, and you talk about assisted migration, you might get in trouble with people representing nature conservation, because they very often want to stick to the kind of local species. But that's another topic, and maybe we'll have a dedicated webinar on this topic. I would like to ask a question from the audience. It's for Stephanie. And in one of your slides, you showed the puzzle of key enabling factors for forest landscape restoration in Africa, and that included also the political environment. And the question is, what, in your opinion, would be a favorable political environment for successful, of course, successful forest restoration at a jurisdictional level?
Yes, and I tried to answer that in the chat, but I ran out of time as I was trying to listen at the same time. So it's some of the examples that I posted. So looking at ways of actually having agencies that might be working across different sectors, so intersectoral agencies that can implement actions in a landscape or a lower jurisdiction level than necessarily than the national level, if that's relevant. The importance of tenure arrangements as well, and in many cases it's not necessarily going to be feasible to have full legal tenure according to the national system, simply because of the lengthy processes involved and the challenges at the national scale. So at lower scales, there are examples of certificates that might be recognized and that might be easier to develop and to sort of have in place. So that's another sort of policy that can be implemented. So yes, there's many of the examples, the partnership examples that I mentioned as well are some of the important arrangements that can be achieved at the lower scales. Yeah, I think I'll stop there for now.
Thank you very much. And we're also actually trying to promote speakers, but it didn't work. So I would also ask the next question from the chat, and then maybe we'll manage to promote Isabella, who has asked a question in the chat. But now this question is from Eduardo Vincenti, and he asked, like, considering the well-documented lack of native seeds worldwide, also coming back to the seeds, what kind of reproductive material is being used in the restoration projects that you introduced?
So that's not something that I was looking at. But I'm off the top of my head, I'm thinking of an example from Brazil in the Xingu indigenous landscape, where there's a whole seed network that's been developed with the indigenous community collecting seeds from the neighboring forests. So there are positive examples like that. But for sure, it is a challenge to ensure that the genetic diversity is there in restoration. But that wasn't something I was exploring, or it's certainly not my area of expertise. I think Magda might have something to say about that.
Perhaps, Gesche, I can remember we had also kind of discussion in the January talk of Markus Höhl, because he was presenting also the results from Ethiopia. And perhaps also one interesting idea is also on also perhaps also successful procedure in Ethiopia, working with exclosures. That means that it's more or less natural regeneration of local species, but then perhaps doing some completion plantings to include perhaps also some more commercial species. So, but of course, the question of local seed sources and also local seed nurseries. This is really one critical aspect of forest landscape restoration, especially if we look into a more near natural or ecological restoration.
Yeah, that's true indeed. And also in our superb demonstration areas, we in many areas actually we foster natural regeneration to kind of to deal with the lack of availability of seeds. Now it's Isabella's turn, I think. We can't hear you, Isabella.
How about now? Okay, yeah, thank you. So my question is, how can you encourage ecological restoration on government-owned land? And I'm referring to an example from Kenya in particular, where all the land is government-owned, especially the hilltops that are supposed to be forested. And those are degraded because they're used for necessary but illegal firewood collection. And this there is kind of interest to restore them, but also kind of not. And the adjacent lands are also privately owned a lot, but they're fallow. So you cannot even establish like a buffer zone to the government land, for example, to enhance restoration. So what are ideas to tackle this, to motivate people to give their private land or to even get engaged in the publicly owned land?
Who wants to respond?
Should I start? Well, it's I think it's interesting because it's at the end of the day, most of forest landscape restoration will probably be on publicly owned land. And maybe I'm sticking my neck out there, but I think associated with the huge government targets, you've got the example in Kenya, you've got a 10% minimum forest cover. So there is an incentive on government-owned land to restore. Now, of course, because of issues of a whole range of development issues, you do have encroachment, you do have use of those lands by the community. And that's where it goes back to the issue of actually bringing in the different stakeholders and having mechanisms to actually have a participatory process and some sort of vision or objectives for the land that can reconcile both the needs of the communities, and they might be nomadic communities that use that land because of their way of life, together with agriculture communities, together with maybe protected area staff from the that are, if there's protected areas in that government-owned land. But the question is, and that is the big challenge, is to actually reconcile the different priorities and to come to some mechanisms that can bring those different interests to align those different interests. And that will take time. That will take both carrots and sticks. And it will take as well some sort of negotiated process that might require as well some written. I mentioned that in many cases there's some sort of written document, some sort of charter, some sort of vision setting exercise that culminates in a document. But those are all important processes that need to happen so that different priorities can be reconciled. And it's not just the priority of saying, well, if we've got 10% forest cover, we need to establish that, and that it's just a government top-down imposed approach, but you do need to work with the different interests that are in that landscape. And ultimately, that will mean that there will be some trade-offs.
Maybe to add to that, I think Ghana had a example, a success story in such engagement, as I indicated earlier with the modified Tonja system. We all know that the Tonja system has been in existence in Asia for a very long time, but we renamed it modified because of certain additions, and 3 key things were added. One was the free access of land now to the local people. Second is also the 100% benefit of the food crop that you cultivate at the early stage of the establishment of the plantation. The other benefit is also the 40% of the matured tree that is cultivated after 25 years or during thinning. This, just like Stephanie said, it didn't take just a day for a government to take that decision. It took a few years of series of studies. It took years of negotiations, consultation in Ghana, and a whole book has been written on it, of the benefit sharing schemes in Ghana. So it took series of time to pilot to see how it will work and how the challenges that may encounter, and who besides the local, the farmers who engage in the reforestation project should also benefit. So if you look at the benefits in terms of the benefit sharing scheme, we have what we call the 40-40, that is 40% for the state government in reforestation, 40% for the people, farmers who are engaged in it, 15% for the I think the landowners. I told the landowners 15, and then 5% for the local community who are staying closer to the place, because assuming there is fire outbreak, these are the communities who rush to go and protect the forest. So it really calls for trade-off. It calls for sacrificing from the part of the government, and also considering other people, and then having a balance. And it has been a very wonderful success story with respect to the modified Tonja system in Ghana of co-management and partnership with the states. Thank you.
Thank you for this.
We lost Andreas. I'm pretty sure he will join again. So I will just take over, and I will ask Mason to post his next question until we have Andreas back in the chat. Again, the problem that we can't hear you. Can you please enable your audio? No. Worst case scenario, I will need to read it for you and you move your lips. Let's try again. No, it doesn't work. Okay, then please just stay there so that people can see you. And we also have Andreas back, which is great. So your question was regarding to more efficient restoration, and to figure out whether it makes sense to integrate artificial intelligence and robotics to also predict the project sustainability over a long period of time. and also to determine the restoration locations and to maintain the project after the execution basically to avoid human-related problems. And I think that's a little bit done already with modeling, but I think you want to go beyond that. So Stephanie, Mercy, who has a response to this?
I would just say I'd be interested to see what it would look like. But yeah, I mean, why not? We have to use all the tools we can.
Explore.
Having said that, I would also just caution that at the end of the day, we can't just count on tools and on technology. We're dealing with people in landscapes, and we may come up with some scenarios, some models, but everything does need to be ground truthed at the end of the day with in a landscape with people and the reality on the ground.
Yeah, I think yes, as Stephanie has said, that we can't do away with humans. Despite all technology of AI and robotics, we still need the humans. And there is an interesting case study of that. Our work with Wageningen University, we have the spatial team, and we have who were able to do the modeling and everything whilst in the Netherlands. And but coming down to Ghana and meeting with the people, the stakeholders, when we engage in stakeholder mapping and the rest, there were there were differences and many interesting things coming out from that. So we need a blend of whatever technology with humans. We need that. Thank you.
So I'm I'm still back. The next question comes from Dirk, I guess. So the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you. I was wondering, when you're looking at reforestation areas that have been used for like thousands of years for agricultural use, what kind of goal do you set for your reforestation efforts? Like, I come from the Netherlands, and we kind of know what kind of forests we have there. So restoring forests is more easy because you know what to aim for and what species you need to use. How do you set your goals in areas that are so degraded and don't have any reference areas that you don't really know how the ecosystem used to work with which species? How do you deal with that, and how do you make choices for like tree species and such?
Want to respond?
Andreas, maybe you can respond.
I think it falls within your domain. We are coming from social.
Yeah, I will try to do so. But sorry, I have still also an interruption. May you more or less repeat it in a short term, the question?
Yeah, sure thing. Yeah, maybe it's a bit off topic, sorry. How do you set your reforestation goals on places that do not have any reference situations with the original ecosystem that used to be there, that has been degraded for thousands of years by human activities?
Yeah. It's a bit similar, I guess, to the question how we can assess the future development due to the uncertainties of climate change. And this is, of course, a tricky issue, because due to the transformation of the land use system, you can change also the site conditions. So the typical idea is, if you have for example, a swamp or a bog, and due to agricultural use, and so you have drainage and so on, and then you have lost more or less the humus layer or the peat layer. Then it's very difficult to restore more or less exactly the same historical vegetation or forest vegetation there. So, and due to this, it's also important to have an idea about the succession development, and I think also restoration processes has to be adapted to this. But this is of course also overlaid with the idea if you have climate change and then the change of the environmental condition that has to be also counted in. And this is of course very difficult. And this is also I guess the point where you should think about providing options by doing mixture, and especially also mixed species with different site adaptation, to have an option if one or two species are not able to stand the future condition, to have at least also perhaps two or three other species who can then take over. So I think the real problem in the moment is that if you think about the lifetime of a tree, of perhaps many decades or even more than a century, that they have to stand today climate and site conditions and the site and climate condition within the next 100 years. And this is, of course, perhaps a difference of at least in mean temperatures of perhaps 2 or 3 degrees centigrade. And this means in climatic extremes even more. And this is, of course, something which is really a challenge, I guess, both for forest restoration, but also all kind of transformation, forest transformation and forest development.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Geshe. I would like to react to Dirk's question and what just Andrea said. In fact, for restoration, it's not always to restore for a previous or historical status. Restoring an ecosystem is to bring again the function or a functional status according to the need of the society. So what we need to recreate is a functional ecosystem. And then the tools we have today will allow us to assess what kind of degradation of the soil we have, and at the same time to take into account the climate change. And this is where we talk about restoration or restoration for the future with adapted species. So technically, I would say that we have today the tools and we have many experimental sites to know which kind of mixture of species can survive with this soil condition, with this temperature, precipitation rate, etc. So we have to adapt it, but take into consideration what the subject of today is about, which is a society need. So for whom this land, who will take advantage of this land, who is asking for this restoration, and who will take advantage of it. So all of these elements should come together, and then we decide what's the best scenario for this land.
Thank you.
So thank you very much also for this question. So Geshe, do we have another question, or are we at the end of the row? I think you're still muted, Geshe.
Yeah. We do have another question, but I would like to actually read it loud because we should finish the webinar soon. So the final question is that we will discuss today is from Madeleine Victor, and she's asking if you initiate reforestation, would you only focus on monocultures? And if so, how would you go to avoid pest species invasions? And I think you already said that you wouldn't just go for monocultures, but maybe you can still respond. And I think Mercy wants to go first.
Yeah, thank you. I think it depends on your purpose, but on a larger scale, if you want to pay attention to the pillars and also consider the issue of conservation and biodiversity, then we will not go for monoculture. And also, it's also a way of minimizing risk, because if there is an outbreak, everything goes off. But if you have the maize, definitely there will be a survivor one way or the other. I think it is in line with the example that Andres gave in terms of planting or testing the soil to see which tree species would be suitable. You have a mixture, definitely one or two of them could do well, and the others, so that others, if they don't survive, will not affect you. So I will not recommend, but it still depends on your purpose and what you want to use that for. So you can go for a kind of a block-wise planting, whereby you can have one species like a block and then another one species also. You can try that on. That may be the ideal or the best, if it's not the worst case scenario. It's better to go to heterogeneous or heterogeneity. Is to save you and also save your resources. Thank you.
And just to add that it also provides then multiple benefits for the different stakeholders.
Very good.
Perhaps also one comment from my side. I found it quite interesting when I saw in Brazil also the idea that sometimes it's quite hard, especially under harsh conditions, open field conditions, to establish more or less mixed species stand on the scratch. So sometimes it's also the idea to use perhaps also non-native but very stress tolerant tree species at the beginning and use them as a nurse stand. So under the shadow, but then introduce also mixed and perhaps also native species. So this could be also one option. For example, in the case of Brazil, it's that they start with non-native eucalyptus species, but then they are bringing in also 7 or 8 different native species, but which they cannot bring under open field conditions. So this might be also one option and variation. So non-native are not bad in all cases. So it depends also on the functioning, as already you said, Mercy.
I think what's important there, Andreas, as well, is not to confuse the objective with the process to reach that objective. So the objective is not a monoculture plantation, but the use of exotic species or a monoculture in the short term might help you to reach your ultimate objective, maybe. So that distinction, I think, is important as well.
Yeah, completely. You're completely right with this. Okay, so Geshe, will you take over?
No, I think you wanted to announce an exciting event first, and then I will take over.
Yes, thank you, Geshe. Yeah, but at first I really would like to thank Stephanie, Mercy, really for this brilliant presentation, but also the very interesting discussion. And I think there are many aspects were covered in terms of forest landscape restoration. So many thanks to both of you. And now it's also my pleasure. I try to to show this. Perhaps you can see, because I would like to draw your attention that there will be a conference in October 24th to 27th, which is organized by the Division 8, which is the Forest Environmental Division of the IUFRO, called Forest Landscape in the Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Frameworks. And this is very more or less also near to the discussion what we have on forest landscape transformation and forest landscape restoration. So it would be nice and perhaps interesting for you to, and the floor is open also, and the call for abstracts is open now. So if you're interested, you can join the conference, and it's in Évora in Portugal, which is very nice surrounding and a very nice city there. So if you're interested, keep in mind October 24th to 27th with this conference. Thank you. And with this, I would like to hand to you, Geshe, now.
Thank you. I also like Evora a lot. Yeah, but also thank you very much from our side for your talks and your inspirations. I think we should follow up on the robotics and on the potential there. Maybe Messen will be in touch with us and enlighten us what is out there that we're not aware of. And now it's my pleasure to announce the next webinar, actually, which will take place on the 12th of April. And will be moderated by Superb, which is much likely myself. And it will be a presentation by Giorgio Vacchiano. He's an associate professor at University of Milan. And he will talk about, he will refer to the Billions of Trees initiative and enlighten us about the how, the where, and also the don'ts, which are very crucial, I suppose, of tree planting. So please join us, please register. And yeah, we look forward to more inspirations about the do's and the don'ts. Yeah, learning from Giorgio. Thank you very much, everyone. We will close the webinar now. Wish you a nice rest of the day or evening, depending on from where you're joining. It was a pleasure again, and we'll see each other hopefully again on the 12th of April.
Thank you.